Our church is really interesting. It's been around for about 24 years, started in 1993. It was a church plant, a PCA church plant, with mostly Koreans. And our presbytery is the Korean Southwest Orange County Presbytery. I often get this question at the denominational level: what is a Korean language presbytery? What are Korean churches, and why do you exist, and where are you going? And I'd love to share some of my thoughts about the Korean church. I do a lot of work on race and ethnicity in higher education, and I've been talking about race and ethnicity in the church as well. And oftentimes, when we think about race and ethnicity across the United States, and even in our denomination, we think of race in terms of black and white. We think of African Americans and Anglos. But what about Koreans? What about other Asian Americans? What about Latinos, who are also underrepresented in our denomination? And I thought it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about the Korean church and the Korean American church. And the Korean American experience is really tied to immigration. In the mid-60s, the United States opened up their doors for Koreans to come in a war-torn South Korea. Economically, the country was struggling, and a lot of people in South Korea were looking for work. And so when the opportunities and the Immigration Act changed for South Koreans, they started flooding in the early 70s. And one of the things that they brought with them was the gospel. And what was interesting, I'd probably have to take a step back and look at how Presbyterian missionaries, about 100 years ago, went to Korea to share the gospel. This is both North Korea, South Korea. At the time, it was a unified Korea, colonized by the Japanese. But they heard the gospel, and they came to saving faith. And eventually, as Presbyterian churches started to form in South Korea, and people started immigrating to the United States, they brought their faith and they brought their families. And they struggled with the language, they struggled with the culture, but they never gave up on their gospel fervor. And they continued to share the gospel everywhere they went, with their neighbors, with their friends, college campuses. In fact, that's how I came to saving faith. I got saved in college through a ministry called Korean Campus Ministry, Korean Campus Missions, KCM. And they were reaching out to other Koreans, partly in Korean and other times in English. So the 9 presbyteries that we have that are in Korean, it's based on Korean language. So all these Presbyterian churches were founded in the United States, a lot of immigrant churches, and they were struggling, both in language and in culture. But they still held on to the faith, and they held on to the doctrines and the confessions of Presbyterianism. But language is a big challenge. So what we have now is Korean churches that are dual language. You have Korean churches in Korean language, and then you have what we call the second generation, or the English ministry. I was born in the United States, and I probably speak more English than I do Korean. And yet, going to a Korean language presbytery has its own challenges, and attending a church that is both Korean and in English has its challenges, culturally and linguistically. So we struggle with this, Korean Americans will struggle with this every day. Outside in the world, we interact in English, and most of our colleagues are non-Koreans, and we interact in American culture. But then you come into the church, and you're taken back to this other world of what was Korea probably in the 1970s and 80s when people immigrated. It's not the Korea of today. A lot of times you'll have Korean Americans return to Korea, South Korea, and realize how much the country has changed, both in culture and, to some extent, language. So this is an interesting bubble for Korean Americans. We're caught in multiple worlds. One is the Korean church, where you talk to a lot of teaching elders, a lot of pastors who have struggled under what I would say at times the yoke of Korean ministry. A lot of the philosophy, the ministry philosophy and the approach is embedded in Korean culture, which a lot of younger second-generation Korean Americans don't understand. The first generation and second generation Korean pastors have long had this struggle to understand each other, both in language and in culture. And then it's impacted ministry philosophy. So I've talked to a lot of my Korean American pastoral colleagues and friends who wanted to leave the Korean church and leave the Korean presbytery to go to some would refer to as a normal or a regular presbytery. I would argue that they're Anglo-presbyteries or predominantly white presbyteries who do things in a very distinct way. And some of my friends have come to found that this isn't right either. It's a challenge for them because there are certain things that happen in an Anglo-presbytery that culturally may be different, although language they'd certainly understand. So they're sort of caught in this interesting space between a Korean language presbytery, a Korean church, and an predominantly Anglo denomination. But I'm often asked this question, what is the future of the Korean church or the future of the Korean American presbyteries? And it's a good question, and it waits to be seen. I guess we could look at history and look at all the other ethnic specific denominations that have come in the United States in terms of immigrant churches, the Dutch, the Germans, Italians, others who have come to the United States, and eventually the language became primarily in English, and they sort of became regular population, general population. And I would imagine that could happen with the Korean American church as well. But we're in an interesting period in time right now, 30, 40 years of the Korean American church. I'd imagine that more Korean Americans, as they speak English, their role in the Korean American presbytery will naturally change. I see it as a great opportunity. We don't have too many multi-ethnic presbyteries. But I would imagine if you had one ethnic specific group, Korean Americans, for example, it could be very natural that you could have other ethnicities joining what was once a Korean American presbytery, and everything would be conducted in English. And there would be, in one sense, no need for a language-specific presbytery. I could see that in the future. Right now, there's absolutely a need for Korean language presbyteries, as first-generation folks who are now late in their immigration experiences still prefer speaking in Korean. But this raises an interesting question for me beyond just Koreans and beyond black and white. Especially in the PCA, it feels like we have a good representation of Asian Americans. What we actually have is a good representation of Korean Americans. But what of the Chinese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Japanese Americans, and other Southeast Asian groups that are not well represented in the church? And what of Latinos? And do we have Latino-based language presbyteries? That would be something for us to consider and explore. I know that the PCA is increasingly diverse, increasingly open and hospitable and welcoming of other groups, and this is something that we should explore in the future.